You'll notice that our book this quarter has been titled Trouble in Numbers. And indeed, we've looked at a lot of trouble that the Israelites experienced in their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. But then we need to hasten to point out they wouldn't have had to wander in the wilderness if they had done right to begin with. So all these things kind of compounded on each other, a whole lot like when you think about it, the troubles in our lives. It seems like the further we get from God, the more they compound. And then a bad decision begets a worse decision, and that things just kind of fall off the cliff sometimes. And that's a lot of what happened to Israel. We're going to talk eventually. We'll get to talking about Joshua this morning. And if they had just followed Joshua's intuition to begin with, all of this could have been prevented, and life would have been better for them, would have been easier for them. For 40 years, Moses served as leader of the Israelites, and it was a very trying time for him, as we saw. There were lots of highs and lots of lows. You know, we have studied probably till we're sick of it, but we've studied for this will be the 13th week about Moses and his leadership. Excuse me, I'm sorry. And most of what we've talked about have been the lows for Moses. They've been when the people were complaining and when things weren't going as God wanted them to. Therefore, the people were complaining. But also, we may not have talked enough about the highs that Moses had. Can you think of anything that would have been higher than to meet face to face with God, or maybe in his case, face to back? But still, this is a man who God spoke to individually, directly. Who else can you think of that happened to or happened for? That had to be, that's big. Another thing, think about when he stepped into the Red Sea and it parted. Let me have one, Mike, if you don't mind. And it parted. Just imagine the feeling of power, the feeling of awe that Moses had to have when that happened. Moses had just lived a period of time that nobody else in the world had ever lived anyway, seeing the 10 plagues. And then they're running for their lives. God tells him what to do, and when he steps into the water, the seas part. It had to be something else. There was the time they were fighting the Amalekites. We'll get to this hopefully before the lesson's over again. We may read a little bit about this. But when they were fighting the Amalekites, and as long as he had his hands held up, the Israelites won the battle. When he got tired and he couldn't hold his hands up anymore, the Israelites began to lose the battle. So Aaron and others, Aaron and others helped hold his hands up, and they won the battle. He saw the power of God firsthand. When you think about it, we see the power of God firsthand. Walk outside these doors and look at what God's created. We take things for granted a lot of the time that we should thank God for every day. Remember when God first approached Moses about becoming the leader of his people. To say that he was reluctant is an understatement. Exodus 3:11 says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel up out of Egypt?" Moses was humble at that time, with good reason. We didn't really talk about it, but consider Moses' position. Position. He was brought up in the household of Pharaoh. And when he reached adulthood, he left Egypt because he had killed an Egyptian while he was trying to defend an Israelite. Exodus 2:12. So he had to run. He had to leave Egypt immediately. He never really served as a slave. He never made bricks. He never gathered straw to make the bricks like most of the Israelites. He wasn't forced into that hard labor. But he wasn't an Egyptian either, on the other hand. He was born an Israelite. He probably never felt comfortable in either culture when you think about it. But God looks at a man's heart. He knew the heart of Moses, and he knew that he could be the greatest leader that the Israelites would ever have. And he went on to do that. Acts 7:22 tells us that Moses spent the first third of his life learning the ways of both the Egyptians and the Hebrews. The second third of his life was spent as a shepherd, and he was in the very same wilderness that he spent this last 40 years leading the children of Israel through. So when you think about all that, when you think about he knew, although maybe not fully participating in, but he knew the culture of the Israelites, he knew the culture of the Egyptians, he knew the backwoods, maybe it wasn't woods, but he knew this area where they were going to be wandering around. Who better could have been chosen to lead God's people through all that they were going to go through? When you look back, and we have the benefit of hindsight, therefore it's 2020, we see the providence of God working through all of this. And maybe that's a lesson we should learn. One of these days we're going to be able to look back on our lives and see the providence of God. I think of some of the things that happened to us. And maybe if we'd think that ahead, think ahead of time like that, we'd make better decisions. Over and over we've seen the Israelites question Moses' authority. Numbers 12:2, Numbers 16 verse 3, Numbers 16 verses 13 and 14, all these different times when the people were complaining against their leaders. Do we ever complain about our leaders, both outside the church and inside the church? Maybe we think we can do better. Or maybe it's human nature that we second guess. But again, over and over, God declared His approval of Moses as the leader of His people. In fact, God made it clear that Moses enjoyed a special relationship with Him that no other individual enjoyed. Turn to Numbers chapter 12. I want to read verses 6 through 8. And the reason I want to read this is God talking. Pretty high praise. Numbers 12, verses 6 through 8. He said, "Hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, shall make myself known to him in a vision." It's the way prophesying works. God tells the prophet what to say. The prophet says what God told him to say. If everything works right. "I shall speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, even openly, and not in dark sayings. And he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" This was a time when, again, they were questioning Moses' authority. Overall, Moses was a faithful servant of God. Hebrews 3, verse 5. But, having said all that all sounds good, and we've built Moses up. And that's good because Moses was a great leader. But Moses was not without guilt. Maybe this is a lesson we ought to spend some time talking about, but we're not going to today, other than I want to point it out. Moses was a great leader, but Moses was not a perfect man. Sometimes when we're so down on ourselves because we've made a bad mistake, we've put ourselves in a bad situation, and we're having to suffer for that, we need to cut ourselves a break. Moses talked to God directly, and God talked to Moses, more importantly, God talked to Moses directly. Moses was a chosen man. But Moses was not a perfect man. And God still was able to use him. And no matter how imperfect we are, and I'm not saying that gives us an excuse to be imperfect, but no matter how fallible we are, God can use us. And we need to make ourselves available for whatever God does use us for. Because of this guilt, today we're going to read of his punishment and the handing over of the reins of leadership to his successor. One of the hardest things in business is the change of management, the succession of management. And frankly, it used to, this is sort of a personal note, but it used to drive me nuts when the examiners would come in and say, what's going to happen when Walter Glenn dies? They'd love to ask that question. And you have to remember, Walter Glenn's the one who was talking to Steve Maggart one day, and about the third time Walter Glenn came over, if I die, Steve said, now Walter Glenn, I want to point something out to you. You're going to die. And I'm not sure Walter Glenn ever really believed that at the time. But anyway. But the succession of management is hard to, that change is hard to handle, hard to manage. And we see here that it happened and it worked. It worked because God chose for it to work. He chose the right people. But it also worked because as we read through this, look at Moses' attitude and how he handled the passing of the mantle, or whatever you want to call it. However, how he handled the handing over of management. So, having said all that, killed a lot of time with that, but let's turn to page 89 in the workbook, or in your Bibles, Numbers 27, 12 through 23. And let's read through our text. Now the Lord said to Moses, go up into this Mount Abarim, and see the land which I have given to the children of Israel. And when you have seen it, you also shall be gathered to your people as Aaron your brother was gathered. For in the wilderness of Zin, during the strife of the congregation, you rebelled against my command to hallow me at the waters before their eyes. These are the waters of Meribah at Carthage in the wilderness of Zin. Then Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, set a man over the congregation, who may go out before them and go in before them, who may lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be like sheep which have no shepherd. And the Lord said to Moses, take Joshua the son of Nun with you, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him. Set him before Eleazar the priest, and before all the congregation, and inaugurate him in their sight. And you shall give some of your authority to him, that all the congregation of the children of Israel may be obedient. He shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall inquire before the Lord for him by the judgment of the Urim. At his word they shall go out, and at his word they shall come in, he and all the children of Israel with him, all the congregation. So Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua and he set him before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation. And he laid his hands on him and he inaugurated him, just as the Lord commanded him by the hand of Moses. We're not told for sure if Moses was led to the top of Mount Pisgah just so he could have a view over into the land, or if it was a vision where he actually got to see the details of the promised land, like a whole lot like Jesus was presented a vision when Satan showed him all the kingdoms of the world in just a short time, apparently, during the temptation of Christ. But either way, we know that Moses got to look over into the promised land. Even though he was told that he would not set foot in the promised land, God did allow him to see it before he died. God's willingness to allow Moses to view the promised land should no way mean that he changed his mind about Moses' punishment, because he declared that once he'd seen it, he was going to die. He was going to be gathered to his fathers, I think is the way he put it. God reminded Moses again in Numbers 27:14 why he was unable to lead the people into the promised land. So Moses knew he had done wrong. He knew it was serious. And he was going to suffer the punishment for it. Deuteronomy 34 verse 10 says, "Since that time no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." Moses the lawgiver stood in a category by himself. There wasn't another leader like Moses. Now, let's jump ahead. I don't know how much time we have left. Let's talk about Joshua. In God's wisdom, He knew that as they moved into this promised land and had to kick others out of the land, they were going to need a military leader. So Joshua was chosen. In Exodus 17:8 through 13, let's go ahead. In Exodus 17:8 through 13, Joshua led the army. In that story about when I was talking about they had to hold Moses' hands up, and it says that they overwhelmed the army of the Amalekites. Joshua was their military leader at that time. In Exodus 32:15 through 17, and hopefully in 56 years I had heard this before, but I didn't. This hit me as something new. When Moses was coming down off Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments the first time, Joshua was with him. Because it talks about in these verses that Joshua was the one that spoke up and said, I hear the sound of war, hear the sound of battle. But that wasn't what the sounds were. Now, of course, Joshua was more famous for being one of the 2 spies who recommended, when they got back with their report, that they turn right around and go on into the promised land. And if they had, things would have been better for Israel rather than wander through the wilderness for 40 years. Of those who left Egypt, only Joshua and Caleb entered the promised land. Numbers 26, verse 65. Joshua was a wise choice to be the leader. Again, with our benefit of hindsight. Joshua was qualified. And Joshua had the respect of the people because he had already been leading to some degree. I don't know what you'd call him, Moses' assistant, but he was one of the leaders of Israel.
Isn't it ironic that the people wouldn't listen to Joshua's case when they wanted to take the land? But now the people are going to have Joshua as their leader, and they're going to have to listen to him.
Sometimes you have to wonder about the irony of God. He's got a sense of humor, the way things work out. Now, we know that Joshua was worthy, but God didn't treat him just like Moses. God didn't merely instruct Moses just to tell Joshua, okay, you're now in command. He had him take him in front of Eleazar, the religious leader of the Israelites at that time, and he told him to openly place Joshua before Eleazar and before the people. And I guess I need to point out, well, let's look at Numbers 27:20 first. And you shall give some of your authority to him, that all the congregations of the children of Israel may be obedient. Neither God nor Moses, and I'll bet neither did Joshua, want the children of Israel wondering what was going to happen, who was going to lead them, who was going to represent God once Moses was gone. He wanted that chain of succession clear in everybody's mind. He wanted no questions in anybody's mind. Although God was willing to replace Moses with Joshua, He didn't afford Joshua all the same privileges that Moses enjoyed. He didn't speak to Joshua directly. Joshua approached God through Eleazar and his use of the Urim, Numbers 27, verse 21. This doesn't mean that Joshua was any less of a leader than Moses, but again, it points out that Moses was in a class to himself. Now, real quickly, turn to Deuteronomy 34. This wasn't really part of the lesson, but I think it should have been. Kind of hard for it to be part of the lesson. We're studying Numbers, and this is Deuteronomy. But the 34th chapter of Deuteronomy tells about Moses' passing, how it happened and what happened. Now Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, and all Naphtali in the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, and the Negev and the plain in the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees as far as Zor. Then the Lord said to him, This is the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not go over there. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows his burial place to this day. Although Moses was 120 years old when he died, his eyes were not dim, nor his vigor abated. Just a side note, that's a big verse to me. I see worse every year, and it's a big thing for me in the afternoons to get home and sit in that recliner and take a little nap. Moses didn't go through that apparently. He could still see just as well as he could when he was young, and apparently he hadn't lost any of his energy. Moses was an exceptional person. So the sons of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses came to an end. Now Joshua the son of Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. And the sons of Israel listened to him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. Since that time no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. For all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh, all his servants and all his land, and for all the mighty power, and for all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. Excuse me. So, I guess I want to end the lesson by saying we've talked a lot in this quarter about the struggles of Moses, and sometimes we may have questioned some of the decisions he made, or at least pointed to the fact that he could have done differently and probably done better. But Moses was an unusual leader. There was no one that God dealt with like he did Moses. And he was there at a time that the children of Israel needed him, obviously. Next week we're going to start our new book. That's why it was handed out. You see it goes to the New Testament. We're going to study about study in Ephesians. So we'll look forward to that. I appreciate your attention. Appreciate all of you being here.